record. All right. Hey, so this is the second episode of a course podcast I'm doing for my CSUB class. My name is Beau Larimer, and I am teaching at CSUB. I am teaching high school English in spring of 2020 from home due to the current circumstances we're dealing with. Just a brief little bit of background. The purpose of this podcast is really to help teachers in training at CSUB heading towards their credential in English and their degree in English, and thinking the class I'm teaching is teaching high school English. So really introducing them in a broad way to the craft and the profession of teaching high school English. We'll be talking about a couple different terms. We're not going to zoom in too much detail. So that's kind of the audience and purpose. We'll be going into instructional design, aka lesson planning, a bit today, and I have the pleasure of talking to Mindy Montanio, our TOSA at Kern High. You are one. I'm going to talk to Eric Olinger a little bit later. So I know of both you two. Is there third and fourth, or are you guys the TOSAs?
We're just the content area TOSAs. So there's one of us for each content area. English, math, science, social studies. AVID has one. So yeah, teacher on special assignment, just in case they don't know what a TOSA is.
Right, okay, so I'll let you right now kind of kick it off, just have you briefly kind of your educational journey, and then kind of where you're at right now.
Okay, you want me to share mine?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry, you went out a little bit. Sure, so I've been teaching, this is my 20th year teaching English. I started in Wisconsin, and then I moved out here to California. I was recruited to teach in the Kern High School District. And I spent most of my time at Highland High School, teaching 9th, 12th, ELD 2, literacy, until 2018, and I moved to the district office to do what I'm doing currently. So I oversee our English language arts programs, serve as a liaison for our chairs at the district. I work with our literacy teachers and our literacy program access and pre-access. I think that's about what I do right now. We're kind of going into that journey with universal design for learning, least restrictive environment with special education, and seeing how we can kind of merge our two worlds together in the classroom. So
right, which is the change happening next year at the Kern High, where far more inclusive of special education students into the mainstream classrooms.
Yeah.
Okay. What I know the other thing too is I've had a chance to work with you at the summer curriculum design team. What are you going to be focusing on and working on this summer? If you give us a little preview.
That's a good question, Beau. Really what we were going to focus on this summer was instruction. Going out, some things that I heard feedback from our teachers, our newer teachers specifically. I have all these resources at my disposal, which are tremendous and they're wonderful, but I don't know how to use them. And I think going out, we were going to do some recording of instruction in our summer school classes. At this point, I'm still planning on doing that, but I think we're also going to have to shift our focus a little bit, how we're going to incorporate our students with special needs in our lesson design and our lesson planning. And then I think we'll also have to acknowledge distance learning. If this is something we're going to be doing, for the next year or so, this on and off social distancing, I think that's also something we're going to have to look at. How do we make it better for our teachers and our students?
Yeah, I saw an article talking about it pushing into the fall, so that'll be interesting as we all adapt. And I think it's just important. I think some people think of it as different than teaching, and it is different in ways, but good teaching is good teaching. And I'm sure you can speak to this as well. I've talked to people about, you've taught I've taught pre-access, which is the really low level literacy. I'm teaching juniors. Right, this podcast is for juniors and seniors at CSUB that are English majors, and really even looking at those two ends of the spectrum, good teaching is good teaching. You need community. You need those collaborative, all the instructional things we talk about, the collaborative activities. That's gradual release of responsibility. good feedback, good learning targets, clarity of those things. So good teaching is good teaching. I think it applies to distance learning as well. I know I'm really interested and curious to get into the universal design versus differentiation, and kind of how those two pieces of the puzzle fit together. I remember doing my TPA and becoming fluent in what I called educationese at that point, and
Sure.
using the word differentiation in every other sentence. It felt like sometimes not as carefully as I should. So I'm interested. I know a little bit about that. I'm interested to see the other side of things. Real briefly before we jump into the meat of it, is there any kind of message that you could communicate to students at CSUB that are headed towards teaching, possibly in Kern County, and kind of what you look for and hope for in future teachers, as speaking kind of from your TOSA perspective?
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head as far as what teaching is. It's constantly learning. It's learning about being a teacher. It's putting those pieces into practice. And I think really the most effective teachers that I know are the ones who collaborate all the time, not just during professional learning community meetings and department meetings, but they're the ones that are digging in at home. You know, they're on a text message thread with 13 other teachers about how I teach Hamlet soliloquy. So I think it's those teachers who are willing to really be a part of the whole process and to continue learning. As a teacher, it doesn't stop your first year when you walk in the door. I think, listening, reaching out to people, not being afraid to communicate with veteran teachers, I think that's terrific.
Yeah. I know, I found that to serve me as just looking at it as every year trying something, trying to improve that little 5% better. And we talked about that yesterday with Josh. So jumping now kind of into the meat of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about in this podcast kind of the theory first, and then move into kind of the more concrete practice of instructional design and how that relates to good instruction. In looking at the terms universal design for learning, differentiation, and gradual release of responsibility, which do you think would be better to talk about first? Is there an order to them?
I don't think there's an order. I think they all kind of work together. You and I talked a lot last year and over the summer, the gradual release of responsibility. We looked at our curricular resources and how we get kids to move to that last independent phase of learning. So I think using that as an overall template for lesson design is good. I think it's important for your teachers, your future teachers, to understand the difference between UDL and differentiation. They're not radically different from each other. In fact, if they just Google what is the difference between UDL and differentiation, they'll find a lot of Venn diagrams out there.
Right, yeah. And I'll have our articles they'll read. If it's okay, I think we'll talk a little bit about gradual release of responsibility, because that's really designed, I know it's designed for kind of the instructional side of things, where UDL and differentiation is looking through the lens of inclusion, correct? Right.
And it's a framework for that.
It's a framework.
Yes, for sure.
Right. And these three complement each other, right? They're not at odds with each other.
No, not at all.
Perfect. You mind talking a little bit about, I have the image up, gradual release of responsibility. I think most people are familiar with these kind of side-by-side triangles, which makes it look really linear. Do you mind kind of talking about kind of what those pieces are? Break in brief.
Sure. And I think too, linking that text, with this podcast as well would be great. So when we talk about how we teach, I think this is kind of the instructional model rather than, it is part of the lesson design, but I think for future teachers to recognize, you don't always have to follow a linear method of instruction. And so you can see from this picture that you have up right now, I think it's important teachers have to have a purpose for why they're teaching. It creates that relevance and that motivation for students. But then really what I like about this graphic is that teachers and students can enter learning at multiple points. So in the past, I think when I was learning how to be a teacher, I was told you do a warm up and then you do your direct instruction. You give kids some practice time. You check in, then, you assign them homework for independent practice. And I think this model And I don't know if the graphic is Fisher and Frey. I see there's another copyright down here. But what they're saying is that as long as you hit these different points in your instructional model, the I do it, where the teacher maybe is providing a short lesson, a lecture, or something where they're showing how to do something, that modeling piece, that component's important for students to have. And then they move into the we do it together, that collaborative piece. And eventually what we want them to get to is that last part where they can do something on their own, which truly shows that they're able to show or demonstrate learning of that concept. So I really do like this graphic because it does show you can easily move, with good planning, you can easily move in and out of these different phases of instruction.
Right, and guided instruction, I think, is kind of where we'll go next. Guided instruction oftentimes is where you come alongside and enrich the student that needs a bit more challenge, and intervene and kind of assist students that maybe need a little bit of extra help moving into understanding a lesson or practicing a skill. So I think all those things overlap. I think that you do them when you need to do them, right? And I think as well, that the goal is, I've talked about active versus passive learning. It's easy to fall into direct instruction and independent learning, right? Which is basically talking at the kids and assigning something to them, right? I know as an early teacher that I fell into that so often, right? Talk at them. Hey, then go do this on your own, right? Or go start this on your own. Because it is easier to assign and talk at someone or lecture at someone. And the craft of teaching is coming alongside the students. I heard this phrase a couple years in, guide on the side, not just a sage on the stage. And you do have to do both, but I think it's important that you really pursue empowering the student as a learner, right? And really push into getting them active and practicing. So we'll kind of come back to this idea in a second. Is it okay if we move now to, and I'm gonna stop screen share. I don't want to sit in this too long.
And I would just add, Beau, going back through, if you have Fisher and Frey at home, I think showing your students those different models, I think you ultimately want to get to that gradual release of responsibility where you're looking at that graphic that you had up. But I think it's important for them to see what you said. I'm direct lecturing for 50 minutes and then I'm giving my students something to work. It happens sometimes, and there are times that needs to happen, but I think they need to see all those different phases that Fisher and Frey have in their book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the graphic I showed you is from, correct me if I'm wrong, it's Better Teaching from Learning. What's the exact?
Better Learning Through Structured Teaching.
Better Learning Through Structured Teaching. The pieces with it, I just want to make sure I said it. Yeah, Better Learning Through Structured Teaching is kind of one of their key books, and it's very accessible, very small. But I'll link an article that's an excerpt from that book that shows that graphic and kind of defines that framework really well. So moving now to differentiation, that's one that I remember from my TPAs. However, differentiation, I saw a really great graphic that showed it as one puzzle piece and UDL is the other puzzle piece. Could you kind of talk about where they're different, but then also where they complement each other in defining those terms a bit?
Yes. And like I said, I mean, your students could just Google a Venn diagram of these two. There's so much information out there. Like I remember a couple of years ago sitting in a workshop with Dr. Jill Hamilton Bunch from Point Loma, and she was saying, stop saying differentiation. UDL is what is going to replace it. And that stuck with me because I had heard a little bit about it. And I would encourage your students to go to the website, the CAST website, and look at it themselves because there's some terrific graphics from that. Let me start with what they both do and how they're similar. I think that'll be easier, and then what they look like separately.
Okay.
I think with UDL and differentiation, they're both useful, and like you said, I think they fit together really well. They both emphasize student learning. Both of them address individual student needs and try to incorporate methods of teaching that emphasize student needs. They provide access to high-level content, and both of them monitor and assess student learning. And like we were looking at that one phase on the graphic of independent practice, I think what freaks people out about differentiation in UDL is they think that they have to teach this way, but really it's that guided instruction. It's working with the students independently to meet them where they're at. So UDL, the difference between the two, and I really liked this, I saw this when I was trying to do a little research on it. With UDL, the idea is to fix the lesson. And with differentiation, oftentimes that's referred to as fixing the student. So I think when we move to UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, it's putting all of that effort at meeting students' individual needs. It's anticipating what they're going to need prior to teaching the lesson. And that's the biggest difference. Differentiation happens after you teach the lesson. So it's kind of that reactive evaluation of student needs, and it's based kind of on the environment of learning, what you've taught, what they need to know, and then you differentiate. And I think that that's hard for especially high school teachers because we're not used to teaching that way. You know, most of our instruction is at the middle, or depending on what level class we have, it could be to the higher kids, to the lower kids. But what I really like about the Universal Design for Learning is that you're anticipating all of these different needs before you're teaching the lesson. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention this and encourage your students to look this up. It's kind of the difference between teaching in a deficit model, where we assume kids are going to struggle or they're bringing all their problems to us, and moving to like more of an asset-based learning. So kind of considering what kids are bringing to the table versus, you know, what they lack.
Yeah, in reading about it yesterday, I saw it described as UDL is very proactive, right, in how you're designing the curriculum and the environment that it's being learned in, and the strategies you're employing. And differentiation is reactive, right, where you're saying, okay, this is the student in front of me, to your point a second ago. Here's their issue. I saw the point too that there's no, technically, right, there's no average student, right? Do you want to design to fit, you want design to fit a large group, as many as possible, but then you do have to make adjustments and adaptations in the differentiation stage. You shared with me at the K conference a metaphor about kind of getting access into a house that I thought that kind of stuck with me and resonated. Did you change your mind on it? Is that still a good metaphor to use?
I don't know. What did I tell you? I don't remember.
Well, it was about a ramp, or it was about a house, and there was a ramp.
Oh, yeah. It's a comic. Yeah, if I can find it, I'll link it in the stuff that I'm going to send you.
Awesome.
Yeah, there are two different metaphors, I think. There's one, it's, I think, a gentleman, it's all these kids are waiting outside of a school, and a custodian is shoveling the stairs leading into the school, and there's a student in a wheelchair who says, you know, if you just shovel the ramp, we can all get in faster, which I think is kind of the whole idea of UDL. So it's making everything accessible to all learners. And I, just looking it up again, I think that is what I had seen. It was basically UDL.
So that'd be UDL.
Optimizing learning for all.
Right. Hey, so within that metaphor, and correct me if I'm wrong here, so UDL would be, hey, let's just start at the ramp right off the bat, right? Because that's going to be direct. And would differentiation in that model be if the kid's going up the ramp and the ice is too slippery, the custodian coming alongside and adding a little bit extra support, right? Or wiping off a little bit more snow for that particular student.
I think so.
Would that fit the metaphor? Okay.
So I think so. I mean, there's a lot of metaphors you can apply to.
Yeah. Perfect. That is a really helpful kind of description. One other thing I'll touch on, because it's so important to kind of the act of actually constructing and planning, is could you speak, right? So the UDL differentiation is really seeking out, I believe, differentiation is looking at process and product, and UDL is looking at engagement, representation of material, how they're demonstrating learning in kind of those three tiers. But it's all looking at, right, bringing the student in into an inclusive classroom and making an environment an inclusive environment. But as far as planning and emphasizing skill, could you talk a little bit about kind of backwards design as an approach to designing
Sure.
instruction?
Sure. I think there's a lot of models of looking at lesson design, and I think the one that spoke to me the most when I was in the classroom was that backwards mapping. And again, I'll email you some links for your students to look at. Jay McTighe is one of the people who wrote significantly on this topic, as has Larry Ainsworth. I think that's his name. Yeah, Larry Ainsworth. But I think it goes back to looking at, I hate to say this and I don't want to offend anybody, but I think like your lesson plan is the biggest deal in teaching. I talk to a lot of teachers who, they want to find something that's fun and engaging, but there's not a lot of substance to the lesson. So we see a lot of people going to Pinterest, or teachers pay teachers to find really like engaging lessons. And really students will be engaged if the lesson is planned well. I think they're like sharks, they can smell blood in the water, just like a poorly designed lesson. Kids can they sniff that out right away. So I think lesson planning is so key. If you can get that through to your students and they can understand that, I think that's going to serve them so well for when they go into the classroom, is just have a sense of what it is they want to teach and not fly by the seat of their pants. So
right. Especially right.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah. So especially right in looking at skill, right? The Common Core State Standards emphasize skill, and we're not going to go into this. You're looking at standards-based education and learning, but really the role, right? We're not content area teachers. We're responsible a lot more primarily for teaching these skills, these reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills. So looking at what does this mastery or proficiency of the skill look like? How can then I deconstruct it, or deconstruct pieces of writing or reading that show and model that skill, and then design towards that level of mastery, kind of starting with the end in sight, which is not teaching to the test.
Yes,
and then I think it's looking at a real skill. And then one other point, and I'll let you get back to, you made me think of it, is one thing that really helped me in teaching with the engagement issue is really differentiating in my mind the difference between engaging teaching and entertaining teaching. In the same sense, right? I don't want to be the most popular teacher. I want to be the best teacher, right? Because those can be very different things, right? You can be a very popular, entertaining teacher, but entertainment's not engagement, right? And popularity is not necessarily just quality of teaching. I think the two do overlap a bit, but really focusing on how can I best help the student feel like they belong to a community, right? Being clear with instruction, giving them meaningful skills to practice, providing them with engaging text, right? We have the opportunity to choose all kinds of engaging text, and that's the inclusion element. And then also showing them and helping them feel empowered with the skills. That's the way you engage, I do think. Yeah, so I was going to move on a second. I kind of interrupted your thought though. Was there something you were going to say kind of in talking about backwards design a little bit more?
Just a little bit more. I think you hit the nail on the head. You start with the end in mind. And so, we always say, to what end want to teach a lesson? And I think that you start with whatever skill or standard. And like you said, you're not going to get into the standards today, but we always encourage our teachers to pick 2 standards, perhaps at the most, a reading and a writing. And then really the big question is, how are students going to demonstrate learning? Not that you are teaching, and then at the end, what does my test look like? I think you have to think about that up front. How are students going to demonstrate that they've learned what I want them to learn? And I really like that article that you're going to share with them from ACSD about that. All the lessons have to have these components in them. So I think, you had mentioned before, I think you had talked about this with Josh maybe, so I don't want to duplicate efforts, but just that idea of authentic, relevant assessment when you're designing your lesson, whatever that piece is that you want to assess, that really starts your backwards map. So, and I would add one other thing. I think you make a really good point about engaging versus entertaining. And I hear that from teachers a lot, like, how do I motivate my students? And it's something else that Jill Hamilton Bunch said. She's like, you cannot motivate kids unless there are two things, and one is interest and the other is capability. And so having interest in what they're learning, and that's part of the teacher, it's making that engaging for the student, and then their capability is what you've taught them. So being able to demonstrate that learning, I think that's really what motivates kids. So
yeah, absolutely. And not to suggest that Jill Hamilton Bunch has any kind of an incomplete list, but just to add one more, I think ownership, I was talking to my kids about ownership as well, where it's interesting, they feel like they can do it, and they feel like they have ownership in that learning, that shared learning experience with the teacher as well. Perfect. Is it okay if we kind of move from the theory, right, of designing inclusion,
absolutely,
the concrete parts of it? Awesome. So I am going to kind of do a screen share. I'm hoping this works the way I'm wanting it to. Do a screen share, and then as we're in the screen share, looking at kind of a common pattern to a lesson, talk about some of the different pieces of it. So I'm going to kind of scroll up. Real quickly, I pieced this together a little bit last summer, talking to all you brilliant people about kind of the different parts of those four. What concretely, right? What is this? What's happening? What tools are you using for those four different parts? Where in focused instruction, right, you really want to model, right, good learning, show presentation, sometimes digital presentation or performance that makes it a more inclusive experience. Sometimes you do need a direct explanation to the whole class, but keeping it clear and short. And then big pieces of the differentiated or guided, really the guided instruction or differentiated instruction is moving and working with specific groups of students that need enrichment or intervention, providing them a little bit of that extra template, right, or sentence starter, or coming alongside the kid and systematically conferencing for feedback or using a checklist. And then intentionally building in collaborative practice with different discussion activities, class presentations and performances, small group conferencing kind of overlapping as well, jigsawing. John Hattie's meta-analysis talks so much, emphasizes so much the power of that. And then independent learning, right? You can help them kind of challenge them with all sorts of different things. Is there any kind of pieces here that you want to emphasize as being kind of above others in utility and importance?
Well, I'd like to just add a couple of things, and I wish that there were times on these, because I think that they need to be time bound. And when we think about focused instruction, that lecture and direct explanation, I would really advocate for this being kind of the shortest amount of time. I mean, as long as it's necessary, but really that lecture and direct explanation, I think this is where you get your sage on the stage. And so I've always heard, in an hour-long class, your lecture should be 15 to 20 minutes, right? Just enough so that students can still focus on what you're saying. And then my other thought was in the differentiated instruction and collaborative practice. Your students just really have to understand this is something that requires a lot of planning. It's not just off the cuff, okay, guys, get into groups and chat. I think that they need to understand that this has to be highly structured and very well planned out. Otherwise, it's chaos. And I don't think a lot of teachers, it's like when something is chaos, they're loath to try it again. And so I think the more
assigning group work versus teaching group work are, I learned the hard way, wildly different. So yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, even, just part of that planning, I think, your lesson planning, I don't have a time to put on it, but just even, as a 20-year practitioner in the classroom, I still go to Teaching Channel and I watch videos of people doing things before I attempt to do them, because it really requires a lot of confidence, courage, and a lot of planning. So I do want to point those things out on there. Otherwise, I think they're all equally important in the classroom.
Yeah, and it's a skill too, and yeah, it takes lots of preparation. So I think that's a really important thing to mention, right? With talking to teachers, future teachers that are going to be going at some point into classrooms, observing educators and thinking, okay, wow, this person has such control and this person seems to make it so effortless. And that's like any skill, right? There's tons of hours of practice behind that skill. And there's tons of hours of preparation behind that skill. I remember that was a frustrating thing for me, is going from working with my master teacher, seeing her do the amazing things she does, and then going in my own classroom and going, what, this is the same activity or strategy, why isn't this working? And there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes as far as building community, right? And the teacher really knowing the well, and like the structure, right? Being very structured and intentional with grouping and how they're systematically doing all those things. Awesome. So could we talk a little, I think we're okay time-wise still. Could you talk a little bit about kind of the opening phase of instruction of a lesson, right? And kind of talk about how learning targets are very important in that part, but also kind of engaging with some kind of student activity that challenges and has them begin using those thinking and speaking skills, or writing, or.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So your opening phase, emphasizing they do. I can speak from my experience in the classroom and kind of what worked for me and what didn't. Is that okay? Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah, that'd be, anything.
Okay.
Yep.
So I think, like you said, you hit the nail on the head. I think anything that you do has to be purposeful and tied to whatever your overall learning targets are going to be for that class period. I remember my first couple years of teaching really was kind of like buffet style teaching. I was just trying to fill 55 minutes in the classroom. And so I was, let's do a grammar activity. Let's do DOL, daily oral language. Let's do this and that. And so I think over time, when I really tried to make things, everything connected in the classroom, I would look at the opening phase, and really it's an English class. And so I think you have, I feel, a different relationship with students. You can build rapport a little bit more easily with them in an English classroom. So I think my opening phase might have been watching a video and responding to it through writing. And then that writing and that video would definitely be tied to everything else that we were doing in the classroom. So setting a purpose. I didn't use a lot of conferring in my classroom. I think if I were in the classroom today, I would do that. I see the importance of it, and I see some teachers really successful using that conferencing or conferring. SSR, I know some people are using that, time for silent sustained reading. I think everything has to be connected, and kids have to see the relevance in what you're doing at the beginning of the class period, because if you don't start strong, I don't think that you're going to have a good rest of the class period. So that opening phase is super important. I would say 5 to 10 minutes of just, let's set the stage for the classroom. Let's communicate our learning targets. This is why we need to do this. And I see you have engaged learner through independent or collaborative practice. And I think that speaks to that graphic that you showed them, that you can really start the class anyway. Some teachers like to jump in right away with the collaborative practice. I like to have kids kind of reflect on their learning from the past day, or reflect on something that we would talk about as we move throughout the class. So that's my opening phase. Did you want to jump in at all?
That helps set the connecting it to yesterday's lesson and the skill we're heading towards completing a unit on at the end helps set the purpose of the lesson. I think that's a really helpful thing. The opening phase, I think that's so helpful for that. I know recently in looking kind of at GRR framework, last year, looking at some of James Nottingham's stuff on the pit of learning, or the learning challenge, that's what goes back to that engaging thing, right? Students play video games, not because they're extraordinarily easy, right? They spend tons and tons of hours playing on them. There's entertaining elements to it, but if it's easy, and there's not a degree of challenge, the student would not be interested. And I think the same applies to other things, right? You see kids who say, I got homework again. go and then do up downs till they feel like throwing up and doing these really gritty things on the athletic field. And so
Right.
challenge, I think, is important if they see it as connected to purposeful learning and leading to, right,
Mm-hmm.
they see a benefit to it and they see it leading to
Yeah,
improvement.
absolutely.
All right. And then,
Absolutely.
yes, I'm going to highlight right here. I love that you mentioned it. I remember I was thinking about it as well, right? Active learning emphasizes, right, engaging them, especially as an English teacher, with those reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills, and practicing those as often as possible, for the purpose of engagement, but also for the purpose of building those skills, and avoiding that passive lecturing model. I forgot to put it
Mm-hmm.
in, but the attention span of the average person. Oh no, are you still there? Oh, there.
Sorry. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
I have a phone call coming. Sorry.
Oh yeah. TED Talk has a hard limit of no more than 18 minutes, and most TED Talks are a lot
Mm-hmm.
shorter. Right, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's important for educators. I think there's a reason TED Talk says no more than 18, and most of them are 10
Mm-hmm.
to 15. And really, that's kind of the length you want to go into that kind of thing before
Mm-hmm.
launching into the practice of skills. Um, could you talk a little bit about that phase of the present the instruction, possibly talk about the importance of modeling. I think a lot of I remember as a teacher, I thought about the lecture in kind of the conventional way, but I didn't think about modeling writing, the writing process, or modeling and thinking aloud as I did a close reading example or something like that.
Right. And I think for me as a student, and I mean, I graduated a million years ago, so I think a lot of my teachers really did mainly independent work or lecture. And so that's what I was used to. And I wouldn't say, gosh, I probably taught that way until I started reading Kelly Gallagher's work, where he was writing right next to the students and doing the work with them. And that really, it shifted my mindset, I think, to see that we are all learners together. Um, Even though I may have the most experience in the room, I'm always looking for opportunities for kids to demonstrate some new thinking. So that next phase of modeling or explaining, I would say I'm kind of like you. I wouldn't lecture, but we might do 5 to 10 minutes of me talking about an idea. And then we're going to shift and talk, together, maybe shoulder partners. But that modeling piece really, I think, again, it was probably Kelly Gallagher's work, and having a computer document or a Word document open, and I would write with the students, kind of thinking aloud, writing with them. And then the modeling phase, I think, really hit me with our access curriculum, showing kids how to read an article, how to engage with the text, annotating, explaining to them what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, and then asking them to work together to do the same thing or to do it independently so I could see that they would do it. So I would say, time-wise, my opening phase in a classroom was no more than 5 to 10 minutes. And then that I do, we do phase, I really moved in and out for myself. The I do, where I'm showing them how to do it, and that we do phase is really where we spent most of our time, or you do together, collaborating. And I really ran my classroom that way, probably for the last 4 or 5 years that I was in the classroom. That's how I function, just because I think kids really need to be doing the bulk of the talking in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
I'm there to guide them, that guide on the side. I think that's such an important model for teachers to understand, but you have to teach kids how to do that process, how to talk to each other, how to listen, and how to engage with each other. And that would be mainly what my class was, I would say.
Right, right. Yeah, I really strongly believe that, where it's people tend to think, well, but you're not at the they do on their own part or the collaborative part yet. You're just in the lecture. But I mean, all the
Mhm.
time, I think it's useful to go, okay, hey, we're going to stop. You're having them practice some kind of note taking skill, right? As you do
Mhm.
that, or you say, hey, we're going to break right here and do a think, write, pair, share, or
Mhm.
some kind of different activity. Right, even if they're moving around the room, to break into a collaboration group, and then do a little bit more direct instruction. You can some of the focused instruction, right, happens later on towards the end, right, where you get them practicing something, and then you say, okay, hey, let's pause for a second and look at where we're at, and let me share you an important thing. Um, Absolutely. So moving on to 3, you mentioned this a second ago when we looked at kind of some of the practical elements you can use. I remember as a teacher in the credential program, hearing people talk about what teenagers were going to do in a group that was educational without me sitting next to them, holding their hand, so to speak. And I think a lot of people think about that and go, "Hey, they can't do anything in a group, right? You got to hold their hand the whole time." But really, that's not the case. There's a lot of good things you can do. How, in looking at 3, how do you kind of emphasize the collaborative element in a structured, intentional way?
So one of my favorite activities to do where kids really talked together and collaborated together was a jigsaw activity. This could be a jigsaw, like a pinwheel discussion, but there's always a product at the end of all of this. So it's not that they can just sit and talk about their weekend or what they're planning on doing after school. I think, again, it has to be really highly planned, highly structured. You're teaching kids how to work together, which is a 21st century skill, that collaborative piece. It's a process to teach. And I really liked for the fact that they might have had to read something on their own and then bring it to a conversation. And then they have some questions or directives, something that they have to do with that information to either generate new thinking or to come up with an answer to a problem. So that they do phase to me it's so key, especially for teenagers who want to be independent, but they still need some of that structure, some of that guidance that you're not providing, but that they can provide for themselves and for others. So I think that phase, when I read Fisher and Frey's book, Better Learning Through Structured Teaching, I think that was just like complete validation for how I think students should be learning in a classroom.
Right. And I just to add in here, we talked about collaborative practice earlier this year, but some of the big things I emphasized was collaboration is a skill like any other skill, right? You don't just assign it, you have to teach it. And it's easier to collaborate if you are one person interacting with one other person in a paired discussion than it is to hang on and sit there as one person in a 35-person Socratic seminar on the outer circle taking notes, right? Which is a way more complex discussion, right? Because it's just, you're not as responsible for carrying some of the activity. So really working in building a culture of collaboration with a lot of paired instruction, with small group instruction, putting students into groups where they're gonna work well, co-creating norms, right? I worked at Kate doing the summer stuff with you. Adults need to do that, right? Adults need to co-create norms together. So of course teenagers do, right? So that is a absolutely important thing. And teaching them how to ask questions, using a writing to learn strategy that makes them accountable with the product. I think there's quite a few tools you can use to teach and not just design collaboration. And kids, teenagers are driven through kind of peer activities like that. Absolutely. So moving now into the closure phase as we kind of head towards the end of our discussion. I heard you a few minutes ago talk about at the opening phase, sometimes there's a reflection piece where they connect their learning. And I certainly see reflection as fitting either of those spots. In fact, I'm type it in right there. Reflection, I think, could fit beginning and closing, right? Because that's where you're fitting your lesson into this larger sequence of lessons. And I think you don't always have the chance to have quite the perfect closure or opening, but it's a general right thing that you try to bring in at those transitional points when you can. Could you speak a little bit about how you use reflection and then kind of what a formative assessment could be at the end of a lesson before you head into another lesson later on?
Sure. I think the closure phase is super important. That metacognitive piece as adults too, I think, and I finished a book the other day and I closed it and I just sat there for about 30 seconds, just thinking about what I had read and how it had made me feel. And it's that idea of closure itself. It's, bringing something to an end. What have I learned? What have I been thinking about this whole time? And it really didn't hit me until I started looking at that cognitive science, how we learn. And I think for children, young adults, we need to be able to synthesize and summarize what it is that we've learned in a class period. And so I cringe to think how many times I just let kids run out the door at the end without kind of summarizing something that they've thought about. So
Yeah, sorry,
for me,
not to interrupt you, but just to echo the importance of that point, I think it's the #1 influential element in John Hattie's meta-analysis on visible learning is students self-reporting, which captures that element, right? Of they're taking the ownership, right? Of how what are we doing? Why are we doing it? How well am I doing on this, right? And taking ownership of that learning experience is so important. And metacognition, reflection are kind of the key. Structure and activities with that are the key things to help kind of take away the final scaffolding, right, and move them into more of a position of ownership and agency in learning.
Yeah, and I think, you've got so many plates spinning when you're teaching a class. You're trying to watch the kids, make sure they're listening, make sure they're doing what you want them to do. They don't have their earbuds in. You've got all these things going on. And so I think it's so important. And I've mentioned it throughout this, this recording that you're doing is just that idea of you're very time bound. And I always, when I'm working with new teachers, save 5 minutes at the end of class. Try and wrap up your thing that you're doing with the kids and give them 5 minutes at the end of class. You have to be intentional. You have to put it in your plan. I need to do a closure at the end. So what I'm going to do is, we've been talking about something really heavy. I might have them do an exit ticket. What's one comment that I have about what we learned, and what's one question that I still have, which is a real low-key way of getting feedback on your own teaching. What did I do well? What did you take away from this lesson? And then what is something I need to come back to tomorrow and make sure I revisit with kids because they didn't get it. So I just think it's super easy. I always had a stack of index cards in my classroom, pass them out the last 3 to 5 minutes, and have kids just write me one comment, one question, or 3 things you learned today. But it was good for me, for my own feedback as a teacher. What did I do well? What do I need to work on tomorrow with my kids? So I think as much as it's good for students, it's even better for me, I think, as the teacher, to get that feedback on my own teaching. So yeah, thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways. I see you've got that in there. I was a big fan of having kids write it down.
Yeah, not to interrupt, but I'm going to add this because Josh and I talked about it yesterday, which is not the same as grading. It's not necessarily grading it, right? You're using that to inform your further instructional plan, to inform what kind of feedback you need, to inform how you're going to differentiate moving forward with certain kids, or how you're going to adapt in kind of a more universal way to creating that inclusive environment and inclusive instruction. Absolutely. For sure.
Yeah, I don't think it's like a my captain, oh captain, my captain moment, where like every class period, it's like accolades as you're walking out of the room. But I think sometimes, kids are really, even if they don't put their name on it, you can still get a sense of what was learned and what wasn't. And, if you do use it as some kind of participation, probably Josh's head is exploding somewhere right now. But I mean, I think it's one way of tracking student thinking, putting the onus on the kid.
Right. And just to wrap up here towards the end, one thing we haven't really touched on in depth, but it's one that I've been looking into as such like a high use thing is, right, we talked about conferring emerging as such a common practice in the best educators' classrooms like Kittle and Penny Kittle, Kelly Gallagher, Dave Stewart Jr. I got a chance to watch, Jill Hamilton bunch, right, is the piece of feedback. Could you talk a little bit about how you kind of pursued feedback in your teaching, and as a TOSA, kind of what the current research says about how to do that well?
Sure. Yeah, Josh and I did a series of workshops last year on using rubrics for feedback and assessment. And I think you mentioned Nottingham before. What a terrific book he has, giving feedback, effective feedback. And, you mentioned Hattie. I think effective feedback has an effect size over 1.5, which means that with effective feedback, kids are going to really internalize what it is that you want them to learn. So feedback, what we talk about, is so important. It's not a numbers game for the kids. And so I think when we put our rubrics together for our district, we took the numbers off because we really wanted the feedback to be about learning and not necessarily about the points that they could accrue from doing the assignment. So I know Josh has probably told you he's had a lot of success being able to confer and talk to the students, and without the pressure of the number on the rubric, kids can really see where it is that they are, where they're deficient, where they're proficient, where they're advanced. I really like what we did with our rubrics after seeing, I think it was Erkin's, what are my strengths as a learner, and then what are my areas of need? And the student can self-identify, again, adding more ownership for them. But I think using that feedback, again, you're going to talk with Eric Ollinger too. It's having a good rapport with kids too really also helps them internalize the feedback that you're giving them, because they're not going to take feedback from somebody that they don't care what they have to say about their learning. So I think as a TOSA in the district, I really promote not using numbers on things that you're just trying to give them feedback for. I think that's really important. It's very hard. It's a huge shift in mindset to take the numbers off the rubrics. And I would say our veteran teachers are super uncomfortable with that. So, but that feedback piece is so important for them. Otherwise, they're not going to move forward in their learning. And I probably was guilty of that for 14 years, just stapling the rubric to the back of the assignment and, have fun.
Yeah, and so two things you kind of indirectly touched on there is, so directly qualitative feedback, right, with descriptors, not this quantitative numbers thing, which falls towards the grading problem.
Right.
And also it not just being at the end, right, here's your paper, right, conferring earlier in the writing process, which kind of allows for the individualized, hey, I'm talking to you, the writer, not just speaking to the product, which I know is a tough thing. I think it's way easier to fall into the trap of being their editor rather than being their coach in that element. So talking directly to the learner. But then what do you think about, have you seen the single point rubric, right, that's kind of designed to be qualitative? What do you think about something like that?
You kind of blipped out there for a second. So you were saying as far as like talking to the student about their learning?
Yeah, so have you seen what a single point rubric is?
I love single point rubrics.
Yeah. You feel like that kind of thing helps with giving it a little bit more immediate in the middle of the process and focusing on qualitative elements?
Yes, I think that as new teachers kind of going into this profession, what I hear from a lot of teachers is, it takes me an hour to grade a paper. You're looking at too many things. I think if we narrow our focus as teachers and we say we're going to focus on your claim, in this paragraph that you're writing, and we're going to focus on that until you can do it well, and then we're going to move on to something else. I think we have to give ourselves time as teachers, and that was kind of a point I would have made, talking about lesson design back there. It's like you can have a beautiful lesson and a beautiful lesson plan. You may not get through the entire thing in one class period, and I think you have to be okay with that. You have to kind of move at the pace of your kids, keeping them going, but give yourself that time. I think that that's important, and make it a small focus for students, and that way you can get through things a little bit more quickly. So if we only focus on one aspect of writing in a formative phase, that's going to be way better for kids than it is if you're focusing on 16 things and they don't know what they did well and what they didn't, and you're killing yourself grading all of this stuff. So I think the single point rubric that's great.
Yeah,
I think that's terrific.
Absolutely. Okay, so the final thing I want to ask you about is the checklist. I always meant to talk to you about this, and now I have that final chance. I saw it emerge in the Access curriculum, and I've looked at kind of using that as well. Could you talk about how kind of you see the student checklist as something that helps them kind of self-assess, self-report, and focus on what they're doing?
Sure, way to spring this on me, Beau. I would say with with access in the checklist, you're talking about a struggling learner and a struggling reader. And I think the checklist in this case is terrific for them because they can see what they've accomplished. I think that's the beauty of a checklist. You know, we can use checklists for essay writing as well. It's kind of the same concept. I think it's a student being able to recognize that they've done something. In that case, it's not about the quality necessarily. It's more about whether or not they felt that they could accomplish that skill. So I know, you know, you had Dr. Rubric last summer talking about all the different phases of assessment. I think you can use a checklist for assessment, but I think that it's a little bit different than the rubric, where the rubric might be a little bit more qualitative and descriptive.
So much as having the student go, okay, what are the important things that I got feedback on, and making sure to include some of those things as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with the checklist, and I think, you know, it serves its purpose in our access literacy program because our children, our students can see what it is they're able to do. And there's a sense of accomplishment and confidence building, I think, that those students need in particular. You know, can I tag? Can I find the title, author, and genre? And an article, can I number the paragraphs? You know, all these things I think build to that accomplishment, that feeling of accomplishment.
That sense of self-efficacy, right? Is what I'm doing is leading to progress and then leading to improvement. So to close up, is there any kind of final closing comments that you would want to kind of circle back to or make in kind of closing out this podcast on instructional design?
Thank you for having me. I think probably really the biggest point, and this is something I've talked about with, you know, multiple teams of teachers that I've worked with, is just having that lesson plan. That's like your ride or die. I think going and finding a lesson plan on Teachers Pay Teachers, you know, fine, do that. But I think that you as the teacher in the classroom can't just go in and blindly teach something someone else has created. You need to look at that. You need to vet those things that you find online and really make sure that they meet the instructional quality control that you want to have in your classroom. I think that to me would be the biggest takeaway from all of this, is understanding the framework of universal design for learning, understanding the framework of differentiation, gradual release of responsibility, and applying all of those pieces and being just super intentional. I think that would be my, you know, hashtag intentional would be what I would leave your students with, is just be thoughtful about what you're putting into your lessons. You know, just I go back to what you said, entertainment versus engagement. And I've taught with teachers who have spent 45 minutes of their period doing something that's super fun and entertaining.
Screwing with the font size of their PowerPoint, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the kids, it's like they think it's fun while they're in the classroom, but then when they're talking to their friends who have other teachers, you know, they're seeing, oh, you did that in your classroom. Oh, you're learning this. Well, we did this beach ball activity for 40 minutes. You know, and I think going back to what you said, I don't want our new teachers coming in feeling like they have to be friends with students. I think having a terrific rapport with them and challenging them. I think no matter what kids say, I think at the end of the day, you're right. They want to feel challenged by what you're giving them, because that's when they leave your classroom. I'll never forget a kid who left we were reading Merchant of Venice, you know, Shakespeare. And this kid came up to me at the end of class and he goes, that was lit. Shakespeare's lit. And I was like, aha, he is literature. No, I'm just kidding, that's so corny. But, you know, he was like legitimately excited about what we had talked about. And I think that is all about good lesson planning, having a good rapport with kids, just being very intentional about everything that you do with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of echo the Shakespeare side of things. I remember being so daunted by that and just thinking how, like, these kids, I think sometimes you have there's the misconception that teenagers don't want to do real things. They only want to do teenager things. And I found that not to be true. In doing Shakespeare, I used to think we have to just learn about Shakespeare. And there's a author named Ron Richart, Visible Thinking, I believe is one of his key books. But he talks about the about-itis, where it's like, I'm just teaching about this subject. And I think being authentic and engaging also is a degree of challenge, but also letting them do some of those real things, right? Not learning about writing, but being a writer. I remember teaching Shakespeare. I used to think I have to teach about Shakespeare, and then more and more looking at, okay, going back to that skill, right? What skill do I want them to practice, right? I want to appreciate drama as an audience. I want them to practice performing a drama and the public speaking skills and listening skills that go with that. And then also being inclusive of like, let's make it real. Let's do something like a video project. And this video technology is not my forte for sure. And I was pleasantly surprised by what the students could do when they had the opportunity to work together, and I came alongside and gave feedback, and we talked about roles. And the students wanted to do something real, and I had students visit later on as seniors and talk about how much they appreciated the authenticity of the activity, and not just this entertaining kind of arbitrary thing, but something that was tough and challenging and scared them a little bit, but was real, right? And allowed them to collaborate and be active and be a participant in the learning, and not just someone sitting there watching another Romeo and Juliet movie, or hearing Mr. Larimer talk about Shakespeare for the next 45 minutes. So I think, really pursuing coming alongside and encouraging students to be in co-creating that learning experience with them, I think is so important. That's perfect.
I agree. And I would say this too. If I have one more thing that I could just add, I love that, you said we do teach skills, and I think that is what our standards ask us to do. But I think we also, we teach the heart as well as the mind. And I would be remiss if we said, we do have literature, which is what we get to teach as an English teacher. And I think that there's so much more than just reading To Kill a Mockingbird, but it is taking kids through, like you were saying, these engaging situations where we're going to look at this book as a window to the world. And it's not just reading this story about a little girl growing up in Alabama during the Great Depression. It's about social justice, and it's about finding your own voice. And so I think, again, anything that your teachers could take away, or future teachers could take away from that, is thinking about what we teach, why we teach it, and how we teach it. And I think I think that's probably the big takeaway from all of this, is having an intentional, terrific lesson plan, but finding those engaging pieces that fit with the literature that we teach. I think that's going to make them the most effective teachers.
Awesome. Hey, so I was going to do this with Josh yesterday, and I forgot. And then, of course, he's doing it in his podcast episode. So I was like, he stole my idea. But I just wanted to close here with just a kind of a brief moment, acknowledging that we're all in our social distancing cocoons and bubbles. I remember I was kind of modeling reading the newest book, The Institute by Stephen King. And then as soon as I got locked into my own home, so to speak, it was nice to just really dive into that book and just lose myself in the book. The Institute by Stephen King, phenomenal read, had kind of reminded me a little bit of Stranger Things feel to it. I really enjoyed reading that. And then I'm reading Atomic Habits currently by James Clear, which is a really interesting book on habit formation and behavior. Of course, I'm applying it to the classroom a bit as well. I say this to ask you, I know you're an avid reader. What have you been able to get into with some of this social distancing space?
Oh gosh. Okay. I just finished, and I don't know the authors to these books. I apologize. Nothing to See Here.
Okay.
Terrific. Weird book. It's about these twins that spontaneously combust. But it's funny and interesting. Obviously fiction.
That one for sure.
Right now I'm splitting my time between The Overstory, and that's I think it's a Pulitzer Prize winner. It was like Up and Coming Man Prize winner. But that book, oh my gosh, you have to read it chapter by chapter, because the imagery and the prose is so good. It's about trees. It's wonderful. And then I'm also reading All the Light We Cannot See, World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Terrific book. I couldn't put that down last night. I was up until 1 a.m. reading.
Oh, wow.
And then the Glass Hotel is another. I've got 4 books right now, 3 books. The Glass Hotel is, I can't remember the author, but it's the woman who wrote Station 11, which is one of my favorite books of all time. So that's about a Ponzi scheme. We'll see. Yeah, loving it though. Loving it.
Rob Polsky was telling me about all the things you cannot see. He was raving about it as well. So
All the light you cannot see.
My now in my now empty classroom on some classroom library shelf, so I might have to borrow that book from my own classroom library.
Oh my gosh, it's terrific. It's terrific.
All right, thank you so much for joining me, Mindy. Stay safe.
My pleasure, Beau.
All right, thanks. I'm gonna click stop recording.